March 1979. Western listening posts in the Barents Sea picked up something that didn't fit the pattern. An underwater contact moving with a speed and suddenness that radioed analysts could only describe in stunned shorthand. Faster than a torpedo. For a moment, people who had spent decades measuring the underwater world were forced to ask a blunt question. How do you fight something that moves outside your assumptions? This was not a single miracle. It was the result of a conscious decision inside the Soviet naval design bureaus to change the rules of undersea warfare. Faced with an asymmetry they could not erase, fewer quiet, stealthy boats compared to the West, they pursued a different path, abandoned much of the stealth doctrine and build something that could simply outrun and outmaneuver threats. The project had a name and a number. Project 705, known in NATO as the Alfa class. The shocking truth about speed, as the Barents detection made clear, is that speed can be both a weapon and a liability. If you want the full extended deep dive, a longer episode with more archival material and technical diagrams is available on Nebula. The context that gave birth to the Alfa is straightforward. By the 1960s and 1970s, Western submarines, especially American nuclear attack subs, had invested heavily in acoustic quieting, streamlined hulls, sound-isolating mounts, slow-rolling screws, and patient tactics let them glide through the deep unseen. The Soviet fleet, by contrast, relied for decades on numbers, many hulls, aggressive tactics, and powerful sensors ashore. That strategy worked to a point, but it left Soviet boats vulnerable when the enemy could simply not hear them arriving. Designers in the Soviet Union concluded that if you could not match stealth, you could change the battlefield physics, get somewhere faster. That logic drove three ambitious performance targets. The new submarine had to accelerate to very high speeds in under a minute. It had to be able to turn on a dime. Engineers set an objective of a 180-degree turn in roughly 40 seconds, and it had to sustain bursts of velocity that would make conventional weapons and sensors struggle to respond. Those were not incremental goals. They demanded a rethink of propulsion, structures, crew, and doctrine. The technical leap the Alphas attempted was radical on several fronts. At its heart was a compact high-power nuclear plant cooled by a liquid metal. Compared to pressurized water reactors common in the West at the time, this design promised roughly 3 times the power density. In plain terms, a much smaller reactor could produce as much or more thrust than a much larger traditional plant. That power allowed the submarine to accelerate like nothing that had come before. Analysts later likened the effect to a jet engine for the ocean, a useful image that hides the complexity of the engineering trade-offs. Those trade-offs were severe and, in one case, existential. The coolant used in the reactor needed to be maintained above a critical temperature. Translated records and engineering logs placed that threshold near 125 degrees Celsius. If the system lost heat and the coolant dropped below that point, the liquid would solidify and bind the reactor internals. In the early 1970s, during testing and initial shakedown trials, a failure of a steam generator and associated cooling systems allowed the coolant temperature to fall beneath this limit. The result, by all available accounts, was catastrophic. The reactor was irreparably damaged. Reports indicate the flagship was effectively destroyed by the incident, setting back the program, costing lives, and forcing a painful reassessment of the technology. There are 2 ways to read that failure. One is as a tragic but contained accident, new technology, new problems. The other is as a manifestation of a deeper design philosophy: extract every last drop of performance and accept brittle systems. The Alfa embodied the latter. To achieve the required strength-to-weight ratio, the designers turned to titanium for the pressure hull. Titanium is light and strong, and when formed into a teardrop hull, it delivered exceptionally low hydrodynamic resistance. But titanium is not steel. It demanded new industrial processes, specialized welding techniques, and manufacturing facilities that could keep oxygen out, often argon atmospheres for welding and shaping. These factories were expensive and rare even inside the Soviet Union. Ships built from titanium required unique maintenance docks and trained personnel. The logistical burden of producing and sustaining a titanium fleet should not be underestimated. Automation was the third pillar. Project 705 sought to reduce crew size dramatically. A smaller crew meant a smaller internal volume and less weight devoted to habitability and life support. It also fit the logic of a highly automated vessel capable of rapid tactical maneuvers. In practice, however, the automation pushed existing control systems to their limits. Mechanical and software reliability were uneven. Reports from sailors and translated technical summaries later described replacement parts availability as poor, diagnostic procedures as complex, and repairs at sea as highly constrained. What looked good on paper, a compact boat with a handful of technicians running a whiplash-fast submarine, frequently proved fragile in the fog of real operations. Hull form and control surfaces completed the package. The Alfa's teardrop hull was optimized for submerged speed rather than surface seaworthiness. Retractable control surfaces and a minimized sail reduced drag and allowed rapid, high-angle maneuvers. In the water at low to moderate speeds, the design performed superbly. But speed in the ocean comes with hydrodynamic consequences. As velocity increases, cavitation, the formation and collapse of vapor bubbles around moving control surfaces and propulsors, accelerates acoustic noise. Cavitation is violent and loud. It writes the submarine's signature across the water at frequencies that passive sonar arrays can home in on. In effect, when an Alfa ran flat out, it often drowned out its own sensors and announced its presence to others in ways a stealthy, slow boat never would. That contradiction was at the core of the Alfa's operational reality. Western sonar operators and NATO analysts first grasped something unusual in 1979 because the contact behaved like a predator rather than a conventional sub. It appeared suddenly, closed distance astonishingly fast, then vanished again. US and NATO reports from the period describe a mixture of alarm and awe, an underwater platform that could force tactical choices by outpacing engagement windows. But the same burst speed that allowed an Alfa to close in also made it, in many circumstances, tactically blind. At very high speed, the boat's own acoustic self-noise rendered its sonar ineffective, leaving it to rely on other sensors, crew intuition, and pre-planned attack profiles. That is not necessarily fatal to a mission, but it imposes severe constraints on how and where the boat can safely operate. Operational logistics compounded the tactical issues. Titanium hulls and exotic reactors required special dry docks, spare parts, and industrial overhead that the Soviet Navy did not have in abundance. The training pipeline for crews on a hyper-automated high-speed platform was longer and more exacting than for conventional boats. Maintenance cycles were frequent. The combination of high complexity, limited infrastructure, and demanding operational tempo produced boats that, while technically remarkable, were expensive to operate and often unavailable for missions. Ultimately, Project 705 never reached the scale its designers had envisioned. Records show only 7 Alfa-class submarines entered service. The Soviet Navy cancelled plans for large-scale production after weighing costs, reliability, and the program's catastrophic early reactor incidents. By the time the Alfas were operational in the late 1970s, the design had already been tempered by experience. They were fast, they were agile. They were difficult to sustain in regular fleet operations. A classic case of a brilliant, narrowly focused solution that failed to integrate cleanly into the broader system it was meant to serve. Strategists and engineers on both sides watched closely. For NATO, The Alphas forced a reconsideration of engagement envelopes and sensor networks. If an adversary could close on a target faster than existing weapon systems could react, you had to alter your pattern, move forces further out, develop quicker response interceptors, invest in distributed sensing. For Soviet planners, the lesson was more ambivalent. Speed offered an alternative path to tactical relevance, but it also exposed the industrial and logistical limits of their system. Records and post-Cold War analyses suggest the Alpha prompted a deeper realization. Success in undersea warfare requires balance. Power without sustainment is brittle. Speed without reliable detection is sometimes an empty advantage. The human element is worth pausing on. Sailors who served on Alphas and those who hunted them later described visceral impressions that cut through technical specs. For some NATO captains, the first detection in the Barents Sea was a wake-up call. The ocean's assumptions had been challenged. For Soviet crews, life aboard a highly automated, speed-obsessed platform could be intense and claustrophobic, with little room for error when systems were pushed to their limits. These were not anonymous machines on a blueprint. They were instruments that amplified both human courage and human vulnerability. So, what did the Alphas actually change? They did not rewrite naval history or render other submarines obsolete. They did, however, force a recalibration. The project nudged navies and engineers to ask new questions about propulsion density, reactor concepts, hull materials, and the operational cost of extreme performance. Some ideas seeded later programs in modified forms. Other lessons cautioned designers against single-parameter optimization. The Alpha remains a textbook example of engineering trade-offs. A design that solved a set of problems spectacularly and created new, often more damaging ones in return. The final lesson returns us to the Barents Sea in March 1979 and to the phrase that startled acoustic analysts, faster than a torpedo. That detection compressed the project's promise and perils into a single moment of astonishment. Speed had the power to short-circuit assumptions and create tactical dilemmas. But the wider truth revealed over years of service and study was sobering. Extreme speed required extreme maintenance, specialized infrastructure, and operational compromises that eroded its battlefield advantage. In other words, speed could win a skirmish, but it could not by itself win a strategy. Project 705 was an audacious gamble, an attempt to build an underwater fighter jet, powerful and frighteningly nimble. It succeeded in some senses, it failed in others. What the record ultimately shows is not a simple triumph or a clean failure, but a complicated experiment with lessons that ripple through naval engineering to this day. The shocking truth about speed, then, is double-edged. It offers possibility and peril in equal measure, and history remembers the cost of choosing one to the exclusion of the other. If this sparked your curiosity, the extended episode with additional interviews, archival material, and technical diagrams expands on many of the points touched on here. For a deeper look at Project 705, the titanium industry behind it, and the translated engineering records that reveal what went wrong, check the full documentary on Nebula.